Let us pray. Almighty God, creator of the universe, we graciously thank you for your numerous blessings bestowed upon us. As we gather here today, as future leaders of this great land, we look towards you for guidance and wisdom in our deliberations at this National Youth Parliament. We ask for wisdom, excellence, and strength for all our leaders, guidance in our schools, and healing of those wounds of separation. Open our hearts to accept those things that are true and to demonstrate love always, so that we and all citizens of this nation can live in peace and harmony. Amen.
Announcements by the Speaker.
Honorable members, please join me in welcoming to this august chamber Senator, the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, the President of the Senate, and the Honorable Bridget Anisette George, Speaker of the House of Representatives. I would also like to recognize members of the Parliament of the British Virgin Islands, including the Honorable Julian Wilcock, Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Cherie De Castro, MP, Junior Minister for Trade and Economic Development, and the Honorable Melvin M. Turnbull, MP. Welcome to the National Youth Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago.
Papers. Prime Minister's questions.
Member for Point Up here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the government having issued more than 3,000 Venezuelan immigrants with work permits, what course of action does the government have in place to ensure their safe departure after their work permits have expired?
The Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, firstly, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has registered over 16,000 Venezuelan migrants, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have ensured that these Venezuelan migrants are outfitted with the minimum wage. A minimum wage, Mr. Speaker, that has been raised in this 2019-2020 budgetary report, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, however, understanding that Trinidad and Tobago is a bit of a small island, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has taken a proactive approach with regards to the departure of the Venezuelans after the one-year period has expired, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are going to recognize the 1961 Convention of the United Nations. Mr. Speaker, we are going to ensure and consider a 2-year extension for the Venezuelan migrants. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, we have, as the cabinet, we are going through conversations with the members of our countries in the region, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government here today is making this situation one that is moving forward, Mr. Speaker. And we are going to ensure that these Venezuelans don't return to Venezuela, rather transgress forward given their time of crisis. I thank you.
Member for Talparo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to give my question. Can the Prime Minister provide the reasons part of Charlotte Street was designated Chinatown? Thank you.
The Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, from the onset, I want to set the record straight. I don't understand the reason for this question today, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, because you see, the Chinese immigrants of Trinidad and Tobago has contributed a multitude of things to this nation. And this initiative that the Port of Spain Corporation has taken up will contribute to our economic development, cultural development, and beautification development within Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, press release was mandated by the Port of Spain City Corporation. and it said that through tourism, economic values, sporting activities, and the list went on to what this community development issue with the Charlotte Street Chinese organization will contribute and continue to contribute to Trinidad and Tobago and transgress and transform, sorry, our nation forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Urgent questions.
Member for Miaro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Education, with respect to the closure of the Toko Secondary School for the past 3 weeks due to electrical problems, could the Minister advise what urgent measures are being implemented to address this issue?
Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the member for Miaro, myself, the Minister of Education, along with the Minister of Public Utilities, we have been communicating, and because the children welfare is my main focus, we have to relocate them to a different school. The children will be compensated. They will be given free lessons of charge to catch up with their curriculum and their syllabus, and I assure you that these issues are being resolved in a timely manner.
Member for Shogunas West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Works and Transport, with regard to the recent flooding in Port of Spain, could the Minister inform the House when will the water pumps to address the perennial issue of flooding to be installed?
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Member, my ministry has already sourced the pumps and a procurement department has already purchased them. They are being shipped as we speak. As soon as they are here, they will be installed. Thank you.
Questions to ministers. Requests for leave to move the adjournment of the House on definite matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers. Personal explanations. Introduction of bills. Motions relating to the business or sittings of the House and moved by a minister. Public business. Government business. Motions.
Minister of Public Administration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the following motion standing in my name. Whereas access to social media continues to become easier due to Trinidad and Tobago's very high rate of electronic device ownership and internet subscriptions, and whereas social media minimum age restrictions do not prevent children from using these online platforms and being exposed to the associated risks, and whereas online bullying and child pornography are among the growing threats posed by unregulated social media platforms, and whereas children may not possess the same level of maturity and discernment expected of older social media users, be it resolved that this Youth Parliament consider adopting legislation to recognize parents and guardians' liability for their children's online behavior and hold them to account. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin my presentation by providing an academic definition for the term social media to enlighten all members of the House. Keatsman et al. In 2011, in an article entitled Get Serious, Understanding the Functional Building Blocks of Social Media, defined social media as tools that employ mobile-based and web-based technologies to create highly interactive platforms via which individuals and communities share, co-create, discuss, and modify user-generated content. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this concept of social media and fit it within the context of Trinidad and Tobago. In 2019, a digital country profile on Trinidad and Tobago was conducted by Hootsuite and We Are Social. The following results were yielded. There's a mobile subscription rate in Trinidad and Tobago of over 135%, which equates to over more than 1.85 million mobile devices in circulation. There's an internet penetration rate of 73%, and over 810,000 members of Trinidad and Tobago utilize social media, with 740,000 members of the country utilizing mobile devices to access these social media platforms. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, it must be noted that the social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, all ranked in the top 20 searches for the country in the year 2018. Now, Mr. Speaker, the motion speaks to various threats and harms that could pose potential harm to children. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to expand on this a bit. So the threats that are associated with social media usage include but are not limited to access and exposure to childhood pornography, cyberbullying, which has a host of mental health complications and implications, which I'm sure the Minister of Health will elaborate on, sexual grooming, which makes it easier for persons who have a predilection for pedophilia to target young persons, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would like to bring to the attention of the House the fact that upon doing research, I discovered that the app Snapchat has the ability to give real-time live GPS location of persons who utilize the platform with other persons who they have as friends. Now, Mr. Speaker, the entire point of social media is to make connections with persons who you may not necessarily know. Now, Mr. Speaker, I can assure that at least the majority of the House has at some point made friends with someone who they do not know. Now, my question is, Mr. Speaker, what exactly stops a child predator from disguising himself as someone who is the age of 13 or 14, adding young children on Snapchat because of these unregulated social media age restrictions, and then luring them, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, that is the relevance of this motion. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would like to now fit the relevance of cyberbullying, which the motion itself speaks to within the context of Trinidad and Tobago. In a 2016 report conducted by the Silver Lining Foundation and UNESCO Associated Networks, the following results were yielded. 37% of respondents indicated that they were at least once a victim of rumors being spread online. 20% indicated that they were at least once threatened or intimidated by someone using social media platforms. Now, Mr. Speaker, the opposition may want to say that that is no relevance because it barely reaches the benchmark of 50%. But, Mr. Speaker, I say to you that for this government, 1%, one child is enough for us to take action. Now, Mr. Speaker, in looking at the rationale behind this motion, I would like to reiterate the point that this government stands firm to honor the international obligations to which we have signed and ratified, namely the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which speaks explicitly and mandates that under Article 19(1), that the government and legislative authorities have a responsibility to ensure the protection of the child whilst in the care of parents or guardians. I would like to re-emphasize that last point, Mr. Speaker, whilst in the care of parents and guardians, which is what this motion speaks to. Now, Mr. Speaker, the other issue is the fact that who gives these children these mobile devices? Is it not the parent? Doesn't that qualify under aiding, abetting, specifically procuring and counseling, which establishes criminal liability as a participant? Now, Mr. Speaker, at the core of this motion is a need to protect our children, our future. A state which fails to protect its children is a state which fails to ensure the sustainability of its own future. Now, Mr. Speaker, that is why, as a byproduct of this motion, I would like to propose an amendment to the Children Act 46(1) of 2012, amendment which the government would express to be dynamic, comprehensive, and a pragmatic approach to deal with this issue at hand. Because not only does it take a legislative approach giving the court the discretion, now pay attention to the fact that the court has the discretion and that this amendment does not seek to negate liability from the child. It merely seeks to extend liability to the parents and guardians and raise the duty of care that is owed. Mr. Speaker, it also takes a pragmatic approach in policy, ensuring that the Ministry of Education integrates in the curriculum social media usage and responsible usage so that children are exposed to the uses of social media, but the effective and responsible usage of it. Now, Mr. Speaker, the opposition may stand and say that parents have no knowledge on social media because of the generation gap. Well, Mr. Speaker, I say to you that while ignorance is not a defense in law, we are putting provisions in place to assist parents who don't have knowledge on the use of social media by establishing a social media ethics committee which will work closely with the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services to ensure that courses in digital literacy are available for all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I would like to say that this motion possesses the answers. The answers are here, Mr. Speaker, and there is no excuse, and this government will not stand idly by and allow any threat to our children and our future. The question is, Mr. Speaker, will the opposition? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I beg to move.
Honorable members, I will now propose a question for debate. Whereas access to social media continues to become easier due to Trinidad and Tobago's very high rate of electronic device ownership and internet subscriptions. And whereas social media minimum age restrictions do not prevent children from using these online platforms and being exposed to the associated risks. And whereas online bullying and child pornography are among the growing threats posed by unregulated social media platforms. And whereas children may not possess the same level of maturity and discernment expected of older social media users. Be it resolved that this youth parliament consider adopting legislation to recognize parents and guardians' liability for their children's online behavior and hold them to account. Member for Superior.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to chance to enter this debate. Be it resolved that this youth parliament consider adopting legislation to recognize parents and guardians' liability for their children's online behavior and hold them to account. Mr. Speaker, I can't fathom that. I don't know. That has to be the most impotent and profitless thing that I have ever heard, Mr. Speaker. So let me explain why that's so. So let's establish a few things. The age of criminal responsibility in Trinidad and Tobago is 7 years old. So this means that an individual having attained that age, they can be charged for an offense, including murder, and including online harassment or cyberbullying or anything of that sort. Now, there is a rule, however, though the Inca Pax, which states that under 7, you cannot be charged, as it means that legally he does not know right and wrong. But over 7, however, he can. Now, let's talk about this motion, cyberbullying. And the motion does mention cyberbullying, and whereas online bullying and child pornography are among the growing threats posed by unregulated social media platforms. So it is a threat. It is a threat in our society. Now, there are no laws in Trinidad and Tobago about cyberbullying in circulation. There is the Cybercrime Bill, which does mention that, and it's before a Joint Select Committee. But there are laws about online harassment, the Offences Against the Persons Act. That's a very powerful act, as it speaks about online harassment. So let's talk about that act. Section 30, Part 1, Chapter 11(8) states that harassment of a person includes alarming the person or causing the person distress by engaging in a course of conduct such as 1. Following, making visual recordings of stopping or accosting the person. 4. Making contact with the person, whether by gesture, directly, verbally, by telephone, computer, post, or in any other way. 7. Acting in any other way that could reasonably be expected to alarm or cause the person distress. Section 30, Part 2 of that act further states, a person who pursues a course of conduct which amounts to harassment of another, and which he knows or ought reasonably to know amounts to harassment of the...
The member is making reference to his contribution. Member, you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is guilty of an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $2,000 and imprisonment for 6 months. And this does not apply to adults only, Mr. Speaker. This applies to children as well. So, Mr. Speaker, I thought we should talk about schools for a moment, as this is the National Youth Parliament after all. So, in the Southern Division, which is part of my constituency, the Crime and Problem Analysis Branch compiles statistics from January the 1st, 2010 to the same period this year. 79 crimes were reported to have occurred at various schools in the Southern Division. Of these, 30 were cyber-related, and of those crimes fit the Offences Against the Persons Act. Now, I think the Minister of Education should take note, because these things happen right under our noses, right under the government's noses, and sometimes we're none the wiser. So, let's make an inference, Mr. Speaker. Let's make an inference. Accountability for children and the law makes this a very questionable motion, to say the least, because it contradicts what the law says. And that makes no sense. We're advocating for parental liability when children can and will be held accountable if they're found guilty. That's absurd, Mr. Speaker. And this bench and this opposition will not stand by the motion put forward. Now, Mr. Speaker, we all have personal experiences with media and technology because after all, we are Gen Z. We were born in the digital age. Now, I go to a school where cyberbullying is prevalent, as it is with many schools, but it is in mine as well. Now, although it's not major, it's still a lingering problem. Now, there was an incident in the past when I was informed to where a child was a victim of cyberbullying, and the perpetrator was given warnings by the police and whatnot, as the victim's parents did not decide to press charges. But the thing that shocked the entire school, the thing that shocked the administration, everyone involved, including me, was that the parents of both students were totally oblivious to the fact that they were on social media. Through no fault of their own, the victim's parents even said that through all the regular phone checks and all that, he still managed to mask the fact that he was on social media. And that's baffling. That is the reality that we're faced with. Although parents try their absolute best, they cannot manage to get all their children on the right path. They can't manage to nip all their children in the bud, as we may say. And therefore, that leads to a lot of problems. So, parents must not be made into failures on account of decisions taken by their children. Because let's face facts. The children are, of course, beyond the control of their parents, who have done everything that they can to lead them along the right path, to teach them what is right. So children do have and should employ the natural understanding which comes with age and the natural ability to reason. So, given all these things, Mr. Speaker, we need to apply the necessary disciplinary measures to train our children in the proper use of social media and digital technology in general. Doing this will safeguard their reputation and, by extension, the reputation of the parents. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we all need to be mindful that children over 7 can be held accountable for what they do, especially online. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to join this debate today. Is not education the art of drawing out full manhood of the child under training? M.K. Gandhi. Mr. Speaker, are you aware of some of the negative effects social media may have on a child? This will include low self-esteem, cyberbullying, social isolation, and poor concentration. Today, we'd like to give rise to 2 points for the motion. Parents give children electronic devices at a young age. Parents give children electronic devices at a young age that they are exposed to certain famous people and they try to mimic these celebrities. Most parents do not monitor their children's social media. Do you know that in a tablet-owning household, 7 out of 10 parents let their children play with their tablets? Because of this, a team of researchers at the University of Iowa have discoveed by age 2, 90% of modern children had a moderate ability to use a tablet. Children learn and follow from their parents' actions. So if they are being exposed to this, what else can they be exposed to? Mr. Speaker, by age 7 or 8, children can log on to social media platforms using their parents' emails and perhaps create an account because they've seen this done countless times by their parents. The way children act online should be a parent's responsibility to monitor. If a parent cannot see these posts, then they are failing to show their children right from wrong. I am sure my colleagues on the other side might say, if children are able to comprehend what they are doing to create these accounts, then their minds are developed. But let me just ask, how can this be? How can this be, Mr. Speaker? Because if children keep seeing this pattern from their parents at a young age and are exposed to this because they are using their parents' electronic devices or they are always seeing their parents on Facebook or Instagram, how can the child be blamed? Shouldn't the parent be held accountable because the child is using their electronic device? To add, another point would include parents should establish rules and regulations for their children to follow. Parents should establish rules and regulations for internet and social media use, such as never reveal personal information about yourself, never respond to a threatening email or message, and if the child has received one, tell a parent. Also do not visit chat rooms, since child predators frequently visit them to meet and exploit children. Draw up a contract with your child that states your rules and consequences of breaking them. Suggest Christine Lee Hall, Program Specialist of Prevention and Early Intervention administered by the Orange County Department of Education. Lee Hall says, we, the parents, are handing these children these electronic devices, and they do not understand the consequences because their brains aren't fully developed. All in all, we strongly think that if you want a child's mind to grow, you must first plant a seed, and parents should educate their children before giving them an electronic device, as well as establish rules and regulations for internet use. Because when you have a solid upbringing, that sustains you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Shogunas West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to enter this debate. I would like to begin by sharing a short anecdote where a friend of mine, she was a victim of cyberbullying, and a boy in her class decided to post a video on YouTube spreading rumors about her online, and it thereafter circulated in his school. So, Mr. Speaker, the point I'm trying to bring back here is that I'm sure that the parents of this male student did all they can to instill the correct morals and values in him, and try to educate him that, cyberbullying is one of the most prevalent and most dangerous acts of social media. And yet, sir, Mr. Speaker, he went and deviated from the instruction from his parent. So the question lies, Mr. Speaker, should the parents be held accountable for his deviant behavior? Mr. Speaker, with that being said, according to page 8 of the National Parenting Policy of Trinidad and Tobago in 2017, and I quote, the parent's role should serve to provide children with love, a sense of identity, a safe and secure environment in which self-expression is encouraged, end quote. The key word here, Mr. Speaker, is self-expression. And while parents allow their children to develop their own personalities and their own individualistic traits, however, self-expression is taken for granted, where these children end up expressing themselves in the wrong manner on social media, whether it may be via cyberbullying or maybe other posting inappropriate pictures of themselves on social media. And notice, Mr. Speaker, that the policy does not indicate anything along the lines that the parent's role is to monitor or to police the child like a surveillance camera 24/7, Mr. Speaker. That is not merely the case. Mr. Speaker, it's highly impossible to monitor what your child does 24/7. And while it is acknowledged that there are parent-controlled apps to monitor children's social media activities, however, there are also apps that children can download on their phone to hide or conceal their social media activities. And the question lies again, Mr. Speaker, should parents be held accountable for their children's social media activities that they are unaware of, Mr. Speaker? According to the Jamaican Gleaner, which is the national newspaper of Jamaica, the author, Professor Paul Golding, he's a dean of the College of Business and Management, and he published an article entitled Teens and Technology on the 17th of June 2018. And he conducted a national survey amongst the Jamaican teens and their usage of social media. And he gathered these statistics that 95 of these Jamaican teens use their smartphones, while 83% spend 1 to 3 hours online or on social media daily. Also, they said the majority of the Jamaican teens that were interviewed, they said that if they had access to internet or Wi-Fi all of the time, they would be on these devices 24/7, which brings us back to the point that I made earlier with the National Parenting Policy, Mr. Speaker, that the parent's role is not merely to monitor their child 24/7, because yet again, it is highly impossible. Especially, Mr. Speaker, when they are not fully aware of what their child is doing online. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, our general statement as the opposition is that we strongly advocate for the fact that the parents should not be held liable for their children's social media activities. I thank you.
Minister of Housing and Urban Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before we can proceed with this debate, we first must know about the subject of this debate, the child. Who is a child? According to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago's Children Act 2012, it states that a child is considered a person under the age of 18 years. Mr. Speaker, in some way, the parents and the legal guardians of Trinidad and Tobago fail to understand the repercussions of their children accessing and becoming active participants on these various platforms. Social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter allow us to connect with others locally and internationally. But when used inappropriately, social media can be a dangerous place for both the child and his or her parent. One inappropriate post can ruin someone's chances of employment, since employers now scour these same platforms to determine the character of their prospective candidate. Mr. Speaker, in 2014, a video posted on Facebook showing a mother punishing her 12-year-old daughter for being on Facebook and for posting and sending, and I quote, half-naked selfies. Do you think if the mother had paid attention more or monitored her daughter's devices regularly, if this incident would have occurred? I think not. How do you think the mother felt after? Ashamed, I presume. How will this incident affect the child in the future? This brings me to another point about the dangers of cyberspace. Unfavorable content can lead to cyberbullying, public harassment, and depression. Mr. Speaker, according to the Police Service of Trinidad and Tobago, it states that over the past year, there have been 56 reports of cyberbullying, such as threats, child pornography, and identity theft. The Trinidad and Tobago Police Service Cybercrime Unit states that a bully can be fined $2,000 or can spend 6 months in prison. A parent has a responsibility to redirect their child. A parent has a responsibility to actively engage themselves in their children's upbringing and the rights to set reasonable limits if they expect their children to obey societal norms. It is this burden of responsibility that makes parents culpable for the actions of their children. It is the duty as parents to redirect their children away from actions they don't want them to engage in. If they fail to do so consistently, then they are just as responsible for those actions as the children themselves. We now live in a digital society where every detail of our lives is shared and posted to friends and followers. Children today are described as digital citizens or natives. Having digital citizenship comes with its fair share of consequences, such as an increased opportunity for sexual predators and other maladjusted individuals who view social media as their playground. Unsuspecting children are lured into this very complex web, which can be sometimes both physically and emotionally damaging. Recently, there have been numerous reports in Trinidad and Tobago where many teenage girls have been kidnapped, raped, or willingly left with persons. Mr. Speaker, all of this occurred because the parents were not aware of their child's accountament with others on these platforms. Parents need to be aware of who their child is speaking to. Parents need to enforce parental controls. They should check the phones daily, and they should enforce a curfew and want to stop using the devices. Parents are now faced with an additional duty to monitor screen time. Parents are the ultimate role models for their children. Every word, movement, and action has an effect. No one has a greater influence on the child than the parent. Quoted by an American television producer and actor, Robert James Kisham. In conclusion, I spoke about how social media can ruin reputations for the child and his or her parents, the effects and consequences of cyberbullying, a parent's responsibility, and the accountament of sexual predators on social media. Thank you.
Member for Faizabad.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to enter this debate. I would first like to say parents should not be held accountable for their child's social media activity. I can attest to being a victim to cyberbullying, and it is one of the most powerless positions that you can be placed in as a child. Not only do social medias have power means of dealing with cyberbullying, but so too does the government of Trinidad and Tobago. What is happening to the cybercrime bill? Illiteracy of persons in Trinidad and Tobago, according to a study done by ALTA, is 62,000 in adults. And in UNESCO, a study done in 2017, 15 to 20-year-olds had the highest literacy rates, and 10 to 18-year-olds accounted for the highest number of social media usage. All this to say is that literacy is linked with the number of social media usage. You do not see 2-year-olds on social media. In a study done by CNN, children are born with an innate sense of morality. Morality meaning that it is an inner sense. They know right from wrong. You do not see a child hiding an A when they get in test. However, you'll see a child hiding an F. This is because they know that they have done something wrong. As my colleagues have stated, children use apps to hide their social media content. And the government might say, since we know of such apps, why don't parents make it their business to know this also? I'll draw a case for you. A parent is religiously monitoring their child's social media activity to then discover that this said child posts a pornographic image of him or herself. The parent goes to remove this image. However, this image was reposted 10 times in that exact second. Government, is not prevention better than cure? We should work towards preventing such matters, such as a filtration system of which persons under the age of 18, any image being sent shall go to a member of the government, and some means of which it will not reach the receiver. It is increasingly difficult for a parent to monitor their child's social media activity, as certain workplaces, social media and phones are not allowed. Parents are not allowed to use these. I would like to address one of the government members saying that, I quote, parents give children these phones and they are aiding and abetting. I do not dispute that parents do give children these phones. However, cell phones are a necessity. Social media is a necessity. According to the Minister of Trade and Industry, textbook sales lowered by 43%. This was due to textbooks being downloaded via the internet and shared through WhatsApp. The internet and social media is a tool for children. How can we remove this tool? I'd like to address the matter of the government said that they have put in place facilities or centers to educate parents on to children's social media. However, how are these social medias, how are these centers, in fact, adapted to parents who might have busy working schedules, working 2 to 3 jobs? How is it adapted for the single mother that has a lot of children or babies to take care of? How does the government overlook such persons? Thank you for allowing me to enter this debate.
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to enter this debate. Mr. Speaker, I am not here today to bore you with quotes and statistics, but rather to take a more rational approach to this motion and use the sense which is supposed to be most common. Mr. Speaker, parents have a duty of care and should not get to choose when they want to be parents. Contrary to popular belief, stop does not bring our babies to us. We choose to have them, and in choosing, we have to accept that responsibility. There are isolated cases of rape, teenage pregnancy, etc., but we are not getting into those extreme cases today. Mr. Speaker, my point is, parents would be more inclined to observe their children's social media activity if they were directly being held accountable. Parents have been held accountable before for their children operation of a motor vehicle, handling of firearms, even children not attending school. My friends on the other side, how is this any different from holding the parents accountable for their children's social media activities? can all agree that children's social media activity is getting out of hand and the old methods are no longer working. Mr. Speaker, to achieve first world status, we cannot continue to do the same thing over and over and expect different results. This is the definition of insanity. This motion we are proposing is innovative, futuristic, and forward-thinking, not forgetting to also reiterate on the legislation we consider adopting, which would act as a deterrent. Mr. Speaker, why are we who we are? In psychology, there's a theory of nature versus nurture. Nature meaning your genes account for who you become, and nurture meaning your environment molds who you become. We can't control nature, but we can compel parents to pay more attention to the ways their children are nurtured. Mr. Speaker, if parents discipline their children and teach them the proper ways to display themselves whilst on social media, do you not think that there will be a reduction in cybercrime? Mr. Speaker, we are holding parents accountable for not what they did, but for what they did not do, and that is instilling the proper morals and values in the child. Parents and guardians should also be held accountable for the children's social media activity where it is deemed that they were negligent in their obligation to provide proper parental care and supervision. Children aged 13 to 17 is going through a critical stage in life. Identity crisis takes a toll on their minds. According to neurologist Dr. Sarah Johnson from the University of Nebraska, has found that adult and teens' brain work differently. An adult thinks with the prefrontal cortex, the brain's rational part. This part of the brain responds to situation with good judgment and is aware of long-term consequences. Where on the other hand, a child processes information with the amygdala, the emotional part of the brain, and good judgment isn't something they can excel in, at least not yet. Mr. Speaker, not at this moment, but if the Speaker allow me 2 extra minutes, I will sort you. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, a child thinks with the amygdala and is not yet fully, and the brain is not yet fully developed. Therefore, it is not rational to hold a child solely accountable. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I pose this question to the intellects on the other side. If I am walking with my 13-year-old child and he throws his ball and smashes one of your windscreens, who would you hold accountable? Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Member for Barataria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to make my contribution. I would like to say that we live in an era that is dominantly driven by technology. A child who has had their social media use monitored by a parent can still access social media in various ways. My friend on the other side has said that parents are the individuals who provide these electronic devices for their children and so should be held accountable. However, children can access social media through internet cafes, they can borrow their friends' devices. They can even use school computers when individuals... I'm sorry, member, I'm a bit pressed for time. They can even use school computers when students are left unsupervised. Hence, it seems much more feasible to educate a child about the potential risks involved rather than holding their parents to account. In order to create a social media account, your age is required. There are minimum age restrictions put into place to protect younger children from the risk online, such as sharing their personal information or viewing inappropriate content. However, these age restrictions are very easily overcome. My friend shared with me that she was on Facebook at the age of 8 years old. When her mother became aware of this, she discontinued use of the account her mother was aware of and simply created a new one. Children have no means of paper trail. There is no financial information or credit card information that can be used to cross-reference their information. How can parents be held accountable when they have done their very best to monitor and adapt to this technological change in society where technology is being implemented in our educational system? Our parents now specialized FBI agents who are able to track individuals. The very nature of social media can be anonymous. You can put You can put whatever age you'd like, you can place a fake profile picture, and you can change your location. Social media is an ever-growing global phenomenon. Its influx of information and associated risks are no exception to Trinidad and Tobago. We, the opposition, recommend that the government reconsider developing legislation to hold parents accountable for their children's social media activities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me.
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is indeed an honor and privilege to be here today to speak on this motion. Now, I'd like to begin with a quote. As a famous Russian writer by the name of Leo Tolstoy said that everything a child does depends on upbringing. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, this means that a child's behavior reflects on their parents. Therefore, parents hold a great responsibility in the way that they raise their children. That is, the morals and values that they instill in them, and the clear distinction between what is right from what is wrong and what should and shouldn't be done, Mr. Speaker. As raising them in this way creates a vital foundation that stays with them for the rest of their lives. Now, it is very disappointing that the opposition thinks that the child should be held responsible. But how can a child be held responsible when they themselves don't even know what is right from wrong on social media because their parents may have failed to teach them? Parents tend to have some sort of influence on their children, and it is very important that they use this influence to set the right examples and guide them along the right path. According to a 2010 survey by the Kaiser Family Foundation, most teens, 85% of those ages 14 to 17, have cell phones, as well as 69% of 11 to 14-year-olds and 31% of children ages 8 to 10 all own mobile devices, and a full 50% of those have social media accounts. That is Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook accounts, Mr. Speaker. And this survey was done in 2010, so as you can only imagine how drastically the numbers may have increased by now. Now, who are purchasing these cell phones? And as my colleague said, it is the parents that are purchasing these cell phones. And I'm not saying that parents should not purchase cell phones for their children. I'm saying that they should be aware of the risk involved before giving them these cell phones to use, Mr. Speaker. As the Childmind Institute states that any child who owns a cell phone is susceptible to cyberbullying as well as other risks. Now, when a child is cyberbullied, they tend to feel all alone. And I actually have a friend at school who was cyberbullied after posting a photo on Instagram. Mr. Speaker, this led her to feel all alone and emotionally traumatized. Is that what we want for our children? I doubt. Now, parents must ensure that their children benefit from these apps rather than abuse it or worse, fall victims to the cyber jungle that has messed up the lives and minds of so many young people today, Mr. Speaker. Now, there's also the risk of their children losing their photos and videos because what is posted online stays online and can be accessed by any user out there. So parents must, and I repeat, parents must monitor their children's social media activities and their online behavior in the way that they conduct themselves online, Mr. Speaker. Now, some may pose the question or think, are they invading their child's privacy by monitoring them? But when it comes to parental monitoring, Mr. Speaker, it is not about privacy. It is about their safety, their children's safety, Mr. Speaker. So there should be no disagreement with regards to parents and guardians being held liable for their children's online behavior. Thank you.
Member for Couva South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I heard the Minister of Public Administration in piloting the motion, and I agree, we must protect our children. But how will holding parents liable for their child's social media use do this? Mr. Speaker, as a member on the government side stated, as a member on the opposition side stated, do parents know what their children are up to? Can they know? There's research that suggests that punishing parents does not teach children values and instead increases the likelihood of secretive behavior. In a 2008 study done by the University of Nebraska, 147 juveniles were interviewed, and all of them stated that they did not believe their parents were responsible for their crimes. This study references that punishing parents may be sending an inconsistent and confusing message to juveniles. Mr. Speaker, lawmakers should question what message we want to send to our children on personal accountability. Will implementing laws to hold parents responsible for their children's social media infraction be more symbolic rather than addressing the real issue? I heard the minister talk about the involvement of courts, and this alludes to civil liabilities and possible court sanctions, criminal sanctions. Yes, the victim may receive restitution if the other parent is able to afford it, but what does the child who committed the infraction lose? Will having parents spend what might be their only dollar for a mistake help the child? Is it reasonable to hold a parent vicariously responsible for actions that they could not have foreseen, and under what circumstances? Mr. Speaker, I come back to the discussion. Should we hold parents and guardians to account? Do we currently hold parents or guardians to account for when children commit heinous crimes? I have yet to see a report where a parent or guardian was charged or jailed for their son or daughter having robbed someone or committed an act of murder. They are tried as juveniles, and so why not hold them responsible for their... I'm sorry, but I'm pressed for time. They are tried as juveniles, and so why aren't they held responsible for their actions on social media? We already have systems in place to treat with juvenile offenders. Mr. Speaker, since the opening of the Children's Court in 2017, over 1,700 children have appeared in matters before the court. This court handles a myriad of cases, stemming from serious to less serious criminal cases, private complaints, as well as children in need of court supervision. The judiciary, in its 2018-2019 annual report, emphatically point out that this court is a rehabilitative court, so that a child can remain a part of the system to attend any of its programs or for monitoring. Mr. Speaker, some of the court's successful ancillary programs include life lesson programs, which are designed to provide skills to minimize risk factors and build a determination to stay out of the criminal justice system. The Children's Court and its ancillary programs covers everyone, Mr. Speaker, the offender, the victim, and even parents. According to the annual report of 2018 to 2019, some 610 persons were enrolled in these various programs, with 292 having graduated from these said programs. Mr. Speaker, the figures are there for everyone to see. There's also peer resolution programs, which is an alternative for dealing with children ranging from the ages of 13 to 17 when they come into conflict with the court. When a child admits to breaking the law and takes responsibility for the harm done, they may be referred to the peer resolution programs, where youth volunteers assist the court in recommending sanctions for the children accused of minor offenses. For the year 2018 to 2019, 27 children were referred to peer resolution. According to literature on the Juvenile Court Project, given necessary time and skills to mature, most youth offenders will stop offending and very few will continue into adult. In closing, Mr. Speaker, we already have a strong working judicial system to treat with juvenile offenders. I believe that the government should instead provide the necessary support to the judiciary to expand on these initiatives and leave them to do what they do best. Thank you.
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for allowing me to contribute to this morning's debate. We are here today to debate the motion, should parents be held accountable for their children's social media activities? I begin by referring to the relevant legislation, the Children Amendment Act 2000, Second Schedule, Part B, Number 7 states, and I quote, "Every person in Trinidad and Tobago who is a parent of a child or who acts in loco parentis has responsibilities under the law. The responsibility to protect the child from unlawful physical violence and all forms of physical or emotional abuse, neglect, or negligent maltreatment or exploitation, including sexual abuse while in the parent's care. According to the laws of the land, Mr. Speaker, parents have the ultimate responsibility for the safety, security, and overall well-being of their charges, and unfortunately, ignorance of technology cannot be an excuse in the failure to do so. Mr. Speaker, I wish to highlight an issue I came across quite recently that had me very concerned. It is evident now, Mr. Speaker, that we need not only be afraid of our children willingly engaging in unwanted activities online, but we also need to be concerned of children being targeted and recruited online by extremist groups. I refer to a story aired on CNN October 22nd this year, interviewing a concerned mother, Miss Joanna, who is a very educated parent and is very familiar with social media and its usage. This is how she was able to discover that her white teenage sons were being targeted and recruited by white supremacists. Even with close monitoring, Mr. Speaker, she was not able to pick up on it immediately due to the fact that the size of which this was being done seemed child-friendly and harmless. She only noticed this when their language had been changed and their behavior changed as well. We are in Trinidad and Tobago, however, and lack white supremacists, but the lure of ISIS has already touched our shores. I refer to an article in The Guardian entitled, "Trinidad Jihadis, How a Tiny Nation Became an ISIS Recruiting Ground." The title states that young men, many of them recent converts, were drawn to the caliphate mostly by promises of money and a sense of community, an appeal similar to gangs in Trinidad and Tobago. Tariq Abdul Haq was one of Trinidad and Tobago's most promising young boxers, a Commonwealth Game medalist with Olympic dreams, now lies dead somewhere in Iraq or Syria, buried in the ruins of a self-declared caliphate along with dozens of his countrymen. Mr. Speaker, let's do the maths. On an average, it takes months or nearly years for extremists to recruit someone. This means while parents are being excused for lacking skills in technology, our children are being targeted. It is a gory image to paint, Mr. Speaker, and I wish I didn't have to, but we cannot keep our heads buried in the sand. The time for excuses are over. Our children all over the nation are facing real threats, and the government takes their responsibilities very seriously to ensure the safety of our nation's children. Even if this means that we have to hold parents accountable, even if this means that we have to hold parents accountable, then so be it. I thank you.
Member for Shogunas East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me this opportunity to make my contribution. Taken from bigthink.com on the topic adulthood and the criminal justice system, Lawrence Steinberg, a professor of psychology at Temple University, told Newsweek, open quote, "It's not about guilt or innocence. The question is, how culpable are they and how do we punish them?" End quote. Many members of the government, especially the Minister of Health, should know that the human brain is fully developed at the age of 25. This can mean two things. Either the government believes that parents are over the age of 25. Therefore, since their brains are fully matured, they should be held accountable. Mind you, not all parents are over the age of 25. And some member of the government is going to refute my points and say that they did not say all parents are over the age of 25, too cliche. Or it means that the government love contradicting themselves because they legally made a person, because they legally made someone an adult at the age of 18, which is under the age of 25. Therefore, and yet they are holding parents accountable because of what? An age difference? That makes perfect sense, Mr. Speaker, but only to the government. Rather than adopting legislation to hold parents accountable for their children's online behavior, the government should re-evaluate the means by which they use to determine who a parent is and how they know for sure that this parent is mature or even suitable enough to be held accountable. For instance, with cases such as alcoholic, disabled, or even single-parent families, these are not excuses to not hold parents accountable. These are very serious circumstances that the government should have been focusing on and addressing directly, rather than simply holding these parents accountable, Mr. Speaker. And to tie this back to my point, the government should really reconsider their approach in distinguishing between a parent and a child. Why is 18 the age of adulthood if the brain can take up to 30 years to mature? The government should keep this in mind. And they should also keep in mind the underage parents involved before placing liability. Making my contribution this early on the debate, Mr. Speaker, would allow many members on the government to refute my point. But can they refute facts, Mr. Speaker? If the government tries to rebuttal on facts, Mr. Speaker, I'm just saying, not threatening in advance, it poses irrelevance. We on the opposition are anxiously waiting on the next grand point to be made by the government, stating that this motion is protecting the nation's youth. And now this brings me to my next point directed to social media. Yes, parents are responsible for the maintenance of the child, their children, until they become adults. And yes, they may think that all of the criminal activities that have been
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to give my contribution to this very relevant debate. Mr. Speaker, social media is defined by Wikipedia as such that social media are interactive computer-mediated technologies that facilitate the creation and sharing of information, ideas, and forms of expression via virtual communities and networks. Social media has various uses, some good, some bad. In my contribution today, I will focus on the bad, rather the consequences of the bad. As most of you are well aware, or I would hope that you are well aware, cyberbullying is a problem that plagues social media and will always plague social media no matter what. But we are not here to completely solve the problem. No, although that is welcomed. We are here to regulate the problem. With cyberbullying, there are perpetrators or many perpetrators, and there is a victim. It is not a victimless crime. In fact, a study conducted by the iSafe Foundation found that over half of adolescents and teens have been bullied online. This cyberbullying can lead to many mental health issues, such as depression and anxiety. These mental health issues deteriorate persons from the inside and might make them feel insufficient. I shall not lie, Mr. Speaker. I have not faced these issues, but I have seen its effects and learned of its consequences. I currently have a friend who is battling with these issues, for he himself had been cyberbullied in his young adolescent years and is still suffering from the consequences of those actions. He is just one of the many cases in Trinidad that I am aware of. For this reason, I, the Minister of Health, have partnered with the Minister of Education to place professionally trained counselors in every school where they have monthly scheduled sessions with students in a judgment-free environment where they can act and help students in a necessary manner. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Miaro.
Mr. Speaker, I am humbled to be able to present my views on this motion. Mr. Speaker, the government, they are like the people who are always quick to blame the mother when something goes wrong with the child. With relation to the motion, this is very unfair, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to Oxford Dictionary, a digital native is a person who is born or brought up during the age of technology. Mr. Speaker, this make reference to us, this generation. We know technology like the back of our hands, Mr. Speaker. Whilst a digital immigrant is a person born or brought up before the widespread use of technology. Mr. Speaker, I represent Miaro. This is a rural community. Many of the parents there did not even go to school, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they do not understand to use the technology. Mr. Speaker, when many of the parents try to use privacy measures on the laptop, we in the generation, we use incognito mode. We use private browsers, and thus we are able to bypass you can access pornography, you can access the dark web, all sorts of things. So therefore, it is unfair to blame the parents for our deliberate actions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how many of us in this generation, when our parents open the door at night, we drop down our phone and pretend that we are sleeping? How many of us, Mr. Speaker, when we have two browsers and our parents walk, we pretend and we go back to the one which seems to be work, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker. Good. All right, Mr. Speaker, this therefore is our action, Mr. Speaker. So therefore, to blame the parents, this is therefore wrong, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, it is impossible to completely ban technology, and the government seems as though they want to do this. As my colleague rightly said, you can easily access this technology by your friend or by the internet cafe, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, therefore, with this being said, and therefore that because we know this, instead the government want to ban it. Why not educate and help children to man up to it, help children to understand? Do not run from the problem, Mr. Speaker, because one day we will be parents, one day we will be adults, so therefore we have to have the capacity from young to know what is right and to make the correct decisions, Mr. Speaker. To rebuke the government, they are saying about maturity at this age. Mr. Speaker, we know right from young. That is why when you are going to the fridge at night to thief something in the fridge, you therefore know if you are looking around to make sure no one is there. When you are watching pornography, you are not watching pornography in the company of people. You are doing it by yourself, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I am not going to be a scribe and Pharisee. I, myself, have hide away myself from my parents when they come in. So this impetuous government, they have to stop blaming, want to cast blame on people, Mr. Speaker. The government, why not blame Google for incognito mode? Why not blame the people, the society for pornography? Most importantly, why not blame yourselves, the government, because you allow pornography still today and it is not restricted or banned as other countries in the Middle East. So stop pointing fingers and blame yourself. According to this quote, based on an article published on Guardian.co.tt on the 12th of October. No, you may not. Based on an article published on Guardian.co.tt on the 12th of October, CXC will be written online. According to the Minister of Education, when this batch of SCA students are to reach Form 5, CXC will be done online. So this shows the contradiction of the government. How dare you want to give the CXC and to be online, and on the other hand, you want to create a motion against it. One thing we need is practice, right? While you are doing past papers, you have to practice. So therefore, if exams are going to be done online, you'll have to practice online, and this therefore create opportunities for children to go online. So what then? Who would you blame when the child tells his mother that he wants to go on Google or anything to practice how to write the CXC and therefore does something else? Who would you blame? Who would you blame? Blame yourselves. In my closing, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say, if the government do not know how to rule, call elections now. Call elections now. We will show how the leaders are. We, the opposition, we will rise. We will rise.
Honorable member, please be guided by Standing Order 48.1 and tie your contribution to the motion discussed. You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The motion, I'm tying it just to show that the government, on one hand, they are saying that technology is
Honorable
bad.
member, your time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Labour and Small Enterprise Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to make my contribution. The National Parenting Policy of Trinidad and Tobago, page 8, under the section labeled the Parental Rule, it clearly states, parenting has been demonstrated to provide a solid underpinning for the cognitive, social, and emotional development of children. That same document, on that very same page, also states an authoritative parenting style that is high in warmth and responsiveness, coupled with reasonable control, has been demonstrated to contribute to the socio-emotional well-being of children. The lesson to be taken from this extract is clear, Mr. Speaker. As a parent, it is your responsibility to look after the well-being of your child in each and every way, and that includes their social media activities. The failure to do so is a neglect of your parental duties, and as a parent, you should be held accountable for this negligence, even if this accountability has to come in the form of prosecution, Mr. Speaker. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, it cannot be argued that as a parent there is no way for you to control your child's social media activities. Each and every internet-connected electronic device that you may choose to purchase for your child has options for parental controls, be they by designers of the device themselves, implementing methods of limiting screen time, monitoring and recording activities that the device is used to do, or through third-party applications that can be installed and set up to perform the very same task. Mr. Speaker, the members of the opposition would argue that parents don't understand how to use these parental controls. But for the parents who may not possess a level of digital literacy high enough to properly utilize these tools, classes are available to ameliorate their deficiencies. As a government, I would argue the responsibility falls to us to provide the resources and revenue to facilitate these classes for parents who are willing to participate. This is something that the amendment to legislation being proposed by the government is set to address. Paragraph 3 of Provision 1 of the proposal to amend the Children's Act states, the court may use its discretion in punishing the parent/guardian and can mandate that the parent/guardian and child engage in a mandatory course in social media usage. Paragraph 2 of Provision 2 of the proposal to amend the Children's Act states, the committee shall work with the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services to provide courses for persons in digital literacy and social media usage. Once these measures are in place, I would argue that as a parent, there will be absolutely no excuse for the blatant disregard of a child's online social media activities. To conclude, Mr. Speaker, as a parent, the responsibility falls to you. The burden lays squarely on your shoulders. You have not just an obligation.
Please be guided by Standing Order 4410 and refrain from reading from your contribution. You may continue.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you. As I was saying, to conclude, as a parent, the responsibility falls to you. The burden lays squarely on your shoulders, and you have not just a responsibility, but a duty to condition and teach your child to behave responsibly, not just in the real world, but in the online world as well. Some who oppose my argument may say that you make the child, not the mind. I say that if you have not trained the child in a manner that they use their mind to make responsible decisions, both in the real world and online, then have you not failed in your duty as a parent, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your time.
Member for Lopino.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to join this debate. I now focus on the third recital of the motion, and it says, and whereas online bullying and child pornography are among the growing threats posed by unregulated social media platforms. An article published in 2014 by Nigel Shigel stated that a 12-year-old girl resident of Florida took her life by jumping off a tower in an abandoned concrete plant. She took her life, and the reason for her suicide was caused by two of her classmates who were bullying her online. Now you're probably wondering, what did the police or the sheriff did? Well, let me answer that. The police did arrest those classmates, but with their attorney, the attorney stated that they had no influence on her suicide, and therefore the case was dropped and the blame landed on their parents. Now, there are some legislation in America that hold the parent responsible for the children's actions, which lead me to another story about a Pennsylvania woman who died in prison because she couldn't pay the fines for her children's wrongdoings. Now, if first world nations are having problems with parents' responsibility, what would be the expected outcome of our little developing country, Trinidad and Tobago? Therefore, I propose that Trinidad and Tobago should be the first country to be known to hold children liable for their actions on social media. To focus on the second point of the motion, and whereas social media minimum age restrictions do not prevent children from using these online platforms and being exposed to the associated risks. We are in an era of technological advancement where social media has become an integrated part of our lives. A study done in 2017 in an article by Martin Oglet-Hoppe showed that half of 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds have owned social media accounts. They own social media accounts, 12-year-olds and 11-year-olds. And another study done in 2019, this year, showed that even 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds have social media accounts. Now, I'm sorry, member, but I am pressed for time. Now, we know that social media do have age restrictions, but these age restrictions are a mere recommendation and not law. Therefore, they can input a fake age and still get access to these contents. These contents may be positive and negative, but in this case with social media, the negatives outweigh the positives. These negatives may be cyberbullying, being exposed to sexual content, and pornography, or maybe being groomed by child predators. But I'm quite disappointed in the government that they haven't proposed a legislation that restricts children under the age limit from being accessed onto these social media platforms. Therefore, with this, Mr. Speaker, I conclude my contribution.
Minister of Public Utilities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to contribute on the motion presented today. In this day and age, it is social media and the internet that makes the world go around. And sadly, our children have taken the use of social media to such extreme extents that if not restricted and monitored, Mr. Speaker, can have detrimental effects on their overall well-being. A child can easily lie about their age and gain access to these online platforms. So since this is the case, what negative effects and associated risks do our children now face? According to the Child Mind Institute, social media has become so integral to our children's life that it promotes depression, sleep deprivation, low self-esteem, poor communication skills, social isolation, and the list goes on, Mr. Speaker. And if the parents do not take responsibility of ensuring that their children, Mr. Speaker, our nation's children, do not abuse their social media usage and time spent on these online platforms, then who knows what our society may come to. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we have to acknowledge the fact that children are extremely vulnerable to certain social and developmental aspects of life. Social media sites are not immune to predators. It is the parents' responsibility to arm their children with information and ensure that these children are aware of what is out there and what they need to do if ever confronted. As technology and by extension, social media has become so mandatory to everyday life that parents are now, if not even more than ever, tech savvy, and there are now apps available for parents to monitor and restrict certain social media sites and usage. So there's really no excuse, Mr. Speaker, for a parent not to be aware and to be responsible for anything that happens to our nation's children. Finally, according to the UNICEF Convention on the Rights of a Child, by definition, a child is a person below the age of 18. Parents are legally responsible for that child no matter what the circumstance may be. If a child commits a felony or makes a bad decision while using these social media platforms, the parents are responsible, Mr. Speaker. According to criminallaw.us.org, minors who commit serious crimes can be tried. However, the parents must first be brought in and be held accountable for their child's actions until the matter is further investigated. So, So, Mr. Speaker, it baffles me as to why the members on the other side are even opposing this motion when legally, Mr. Speaker, according to legislation, Mr. Speaker, the parents ought to be held accountable for their children's actions, more specifically social media activities. Member for Faisabad, you stated that a study done by Alta, and correct me if I'm wrong, stated that a child of the age of 2 knows right from wrong. When the case of a 5-year-old boy slices another 5-year-old boy with a sharpener blade, 5 years old, Mr. Speaker, do you think he knew the internal and external damage that would be done? How can the opposition even sleep at night knowing that they are here today in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, that they would be okay to jail a 5-year-old for this an action that may have been witnessed at home or on television? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Urupuch East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The motion for today's debate asks us to consider adopting legislation to hold parents and guardians responsible for their children's social media activity. While we on the opposition bench do recognize that a parent has the right to discipline and correct their child, we also recognize that it is grossly unfair that a parent is blamed for every action or thought of their child. A study conducted by Jacqueline Eccles on the development of children found that between the ages of 6 to 14 years, the child's brain is at a very important developmental stage. It is, Mr. Speaker, at this stage when most children are being introduced to mobile devices and social media. It is at this stage children become competent, self-aware, and develop a life beyond their families. Minister of Tourism and Development stood up to say, and I quote, "Children do not know right from wrong." Well, I am here to tell you that most children have been taught right from wrong and still choose to do wrong on social media. It is therefore foolhardy to hold parents responsible for human beings that have developed their own personalities and wills. Now, Mr. Speaker, member for Port of Spain South stood up to say that the government is willing to educate parents about modern-day technology, saying, and I quote, "Ignorance is not an excuse." Well, Mr. Speaker, let's see if the government can put their money where their mouth is. Instead of bringing legislation to the House as a form of punishment, what we need to focus on is the proper usage and consistent monitoring of children on social media. In debating this motion time and time again, we have heard the argument that parents are technology incompetent, therefore not able to monitor their children. So the question is, how do we change this? We propose, Mr. Speaker, to partner with an app developer to make changes to an already existing app to make it more suitable for our needs. For example, some of these apps are KidLogger, Minor Monitor, Mama Bear, and Screen Time. Or we can develop an app that is paid for by the government and is made available to the public for free. This app can have 2 profiles. One will be downloaded on the child's phone and the other profile will be downloaded on the parent's phone. The parent's phone will receive notifications and updates about their child's social media uses. Parents will be provided with education about this app at offices that will be provided nationwide through a targeted educational media strategy. According to Robert Hackinson Jr., an educational strategist, we can develop...
Overruled. The member was making reference to a study. Member, you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For those who weren't listening, I will restart. According to Robert Hackinson Jr., an educational strategist, we can develop parent educational sessions to cater to the tech-savvy parents as well as the parent who is technology illiterate. These presentations can be shown through the media such as television and radio, just to name a few. This presentation will also be made for free sessions at libraries throughout the country. We admit that there are many possible dangers to technology and to the use of social media. In truth, some fears may be justified, but we are not a people governed by fears. We are solution-oriented. We propose to fight the ills of technology with education about technology, rather than to sink to punitive measures that will only serve to further divide the very family systems which we strive for in this society. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Member for Tunapuna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to enter this debate. Mr. Speaker, before I continue with my contribution, I would just like to address a couple things that I have been hearing in this House this morning. Mr. Speaker, the member for Vicarious stated that this motion is important and profitless. Mr. Speaker, I would like to tell the minister, well, I am sorry, the government is sorry that this motion on social media and technology in the 21st century is unimportant to you, member. Mr. Speaker, I would like to continue and state that the member for Faizabad said that how can the government overlook areas in the sense that we are not providing proper programs to persons who may work overtime or whatnot, right? Member, I can assure you that the government, through the Ministry of Social Development, through the Ministry of Community and Rural Development, and through the Ministry of Education, has provided many programs to help in this. There are programs implemented Monday to Sunday at various hours within the day to combat these issues. It is then up to the parents, as a matter of fact, whether they want to go to these programs to learn about technology or not. Mr. Speaker, when looking at this motion, I can tell you that it is both socially, economically, pragmatic, progressive, and practical, Mr. Speaker, and we, the government, stand fully behind it. Mr. Speaker, let me draw the House's attention to the third clause in the motion, and it states, and whereas online bullying and child pornography are among the growing threats posed by unregulated social media platforms, the government of Trinidad and Tobago believe that it is the parent that should be held liable for their children's online activities. Mr. Speaker, parents have a bigger duty to control their children, and they have an even higher liability if they fail to do so. Mr. Speaker, parents have a duty to exercise control, supervision, protection over their children. Mr. Speaker, allow me to quote from the Committee on the Rights of a Child, where they say that the parents are the cornerstone for the realization of the children's rights in their optimum development. Mr. Speaker, parents are to act in the best interest of their children. May I say it again? Parents are to act in the best interest of their children. Mr. Speaker, with this being said, I would now like to draw my attention to legislation, whereas the opposition members seem to state that legislation isn't the best possible way to go forward. But Mr. Speaker, in the United States of America, in Wisconsin specifically, the parents can be held as a joint tortfeasor. In Georgia, the law states that parents may be held directly liable for their own negligence in failing to supervise or control their child with regard to the conduct which poses an unreasonable risk of harming others. Mr. Speaker, I now ask the House, if this legislation works in the United States of America, why can it not work in Trinidad and Tobago? Mr. Speaker, the member from Mayaro said that the government wants to ban technology. Well, I don't know if the member fully went through the motion, but the motion specifically imposes liability or wants to impose liability to parents because of their children's online activities, not ban technology. That is not our intention. Mr. Speaker, the government, specifically the Minister of Public Administration, has proposed a set amendment to the Children Act. Mr. Speaker, the amendment specifically takes into consideration two factors, which is parents' negligence and poor parenting skills. Allow me to state what this neglect in this sense means. Neglect specifically states that where the parent has failed to meet the basic need of the child's health, development, and safety. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, it is the parent who is a primary socialization agent for children, and they should teach their children right from wrong, as has been said here many times. Mr. Speaker, before I end my contribution, I would like to end on a quote. Matt Hancock, a previous Secretary of State for the Digital Culture, Media and Sport said that whilst digital technology is overwhelming a force for good across the world, there is a need to address the Wild West elements, in this case, which will be the parents' negligence of the internet through legislation. And with this, I say the government fully stands behind this motion, and we are willing to work with you, opposition, whenever you are. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Cuba South. Member for Cuba North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for affording me the privilege to make my contribution today. Denise Warden states, a child learns how to be responsible by being given responsibility, and he or she learns accountability by being held accountable. I would like to address what the member for Aruka states, that parents are giving their children devices and allowing them to use their devices, so that means they should be held accountable. But if the child is not given the devices from their parents and they are given it by their friends, or they are using their friends' devices, or they are going to the internet cafe to use the devices, how can the parents be held accountable? That makes no sense. Mr. Speaker, we have heard our friends on the opposite side talk about the responsibilities of parents, which we know the essentials are the upbringing and nurturing of our children to become responsible citizens of our nation. But my question is, how can they become responsible citizens if they are not taught how to do so? If parents are being held accountable for their children's inappropriate activities on social media, is it really affording them the proper life lessons to become responsible and outstanding citizens? If I was brought up knowing that my parents was held accountable for my actions, it would just lead me into engaging into more reckless behaviors, because as an adolescent, I'm very rebellious. If my parents says, you're not getting a phone, I can always find a way to get a phone. I want to quote, according to Piaget's cognitive theory, an educational theorist talks about children learning through experiences. Mr. Speaker, are we teaching our children to become irresponsible? While providing courses for parents where they are educated on the social media is good, the government is not fully aware that this is not solving the problem at hand. So I would like to enlighten them today that this is just causing more social issues amongst our children today, amongst our youth in Trinidad and Tobago. Social issues like bullying, suicide, and the list can go on. I would like to quote the motion, which it says, and whereas online bullying and child pornography are among the growing threats posed by unregulated social media, how is the proposed amendment brought forward by the Minister of Public Administration helping to decrease the cyberbullying rate in Trinidad and Tobago? Or is... No, I'm pressed for time. How, or is it creating repeat offenders due to the fact that the original offender, which is the child, not the parent, is being held, is not receiving any repercussions for their action? Mr. Speaker, we do not want to leave Pandora's box open here, where we are leaving our parents to do what they please and get away with it. Instead of creating legislation, why not create policies where we can place our children who are from ages 10 to 18 in youth facilities where they can receive proper development and also learn from their mistakes, Mr. Speaker. To conclude, I would like to say, for the sake of our future world, let us be responsible parents and teach our children that there are consequences for their actions. Thank you.
Minister of Rural Development and Local Government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to address this crucial issue to our nation from the perspective of citizens who reside in the rural areas. Ellen Jean Barrier once said, and I quote, "When parents neglect their responsibility to correct and discipline their children, society suffers. The results are crime and harm committed against others." Do you know what that means, Mr. Speaker? Raise a child without responsible monitoring. Not only does the child suffer, not only does the parent or the wider family suffer, but society at a large suffers. Mr. Speaker, it is a shame that the opposition wants to blame children for their actions on social media. While we understand that children need to be held accountable as a part of the growing process, we also need to be aware that there are limitless possibilities on the dark web and other websites for unsuspecting children to be led down the wrong path, the criminal path. Parents therefore need to step up to the plate and take responsibility to educate their children how to use age-appropriate social media devices. It is a duty of the parent to be aware of what their children are doing on social media. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I plan to address two key matters in my contribution. Firstly, the rural areas where parents are ignorant of the dangers of social media where the children are concerned. And secondly, the effects on children who abuse social media. Firstly, when an injury is caused by instrumentality that was accessible to the child through the parent, an instrumentality, if used properly, can be reasonably safe, however, becomes very dangerous if not properly handled. This is considered to be negligence, and the parent is at fault. It is the duty of a parent to be aware of what their child is doing on social media, making sure they use the internet for a positive purpose and not using it for a purpose that could potentially put their child or other children in harm's way. In a study conducted by the International Think Tank Institute, 38,000 children aged 8 to 12 from 29 different countries, including Trinidad and Tobago, are active on social media. Trinidad and Tobago has a mobile penetration rate of more than 150%, the highest in the region. Mr. Speaker, I am baffled by the opposition. My friend on the other side said that social media is a necessity. How can you say this? Social media should not be a necessity. It should not be something our future generation depend on, but rather, social media, it is not a necessity, but it is rather a distraction and a doorway to escape the world. Secondly, parents for too long have hidden behind the phrase, "It has made the child, but not the mind," to explain for their children's misconduct. Parenting is a moral and divine obligation. Parents are responsible for many life lessons and the upbringing of the child. Children learn many life lessons from their parents, and therefore, the parents should be held accountable. One thing to keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, is the age of the child. The younger the child, the more logical it is to hold the parents accountable. Why are parents allowing these young, undeveloped minds to be on social media when they themselves do not understand or grasp what social media is? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. But in today's generations, words can't hurt you. Words are powerful and they cut like knives. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I would like to end by sharing a quotation by Khalil Gibran, my favorite philosopher. "Keep me away from the wisdom which does not cry, and the greatness which does not bow before our children." Mr. Speaker, I think we can all agree here today that we will weep for the children of our nation if they are not protected by the wisdom of this great house here today. Thank you.
Member for Caroni Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me this opportunity to contribute. The government is proposing that parents should be held responsible for their child's online media activity. But what effects does holding the parent have on a child and by extension the future of our nation? Holding your children responsible for their actions can teach them to become responsible adults. In this sense, it is feasible to hold the child responsible rather than the adult for their actions. Mr. Speaker, I know of a man who has 4 children, the oldest always having to take responsibility for his actions, and the youngest never having to take responsibility because he is, and I quote, the spoiled child. When the children got older, the oldest one lived a respected life, and the youngest child was in and out of prison. This just shows that children taking responsibility for their actions at a young age can shape them to be better adults for society. We are not proposing for the child to be imprisoned or a fine to be paid as a punishment. Humans have an unbroken tradition of gauging the punishment, not just to fit the crime, but also to fit the person doing the crime. We are proposing alternative measures for the child to be responsible, such as therapy and classes for the child to take so they can learn right from wrong and also shape them with reasoning, understanding, and moral values which are needed in all children for the future generation. A woman can have a child and anyone can become a parent, but not all the times the child is raised correctly due to factors such as single parenting and the child being faced with problems that causes them to act out through social media. Mr. Speaker, the government wants parents to be punished for their child's actions, but punishing the parent can have negative effects on the child, such as the parent can deteriorate the parent-child relationship, which can cause domestic violence and child abuse. For the parent having to take responsibility for the child's actions, they can lash out on the child. Mr. Speaker, are these risks you really want to take, risking the safety of the child when the child can be held responsible and learn right from wrong in a different way? Through classes and therapy that the government can provide so the child can learn the correction for their actions. Also, Mr. Speaker, there's the Young Defenders Detention Act, which states under Chapter 13, verse 5, number 2, which says that institutions have been established such as the Youth Transformation and Rehabilitation Center, where young offenders are detained and given industrial training and be taught discipline and moral values. These centers are one of the ways in which children are taught right from wrong and prevent crimes for the future. Mr. Speaker, we can use this as an example for children to be held responsible for their actions. But rather than them being placed in institutions, they can be provided with classes or therapy to teach them what is right from wrong. In this way, we eradicate the problem from the root instead of trusting parents to do so. Mr. Speaker, I conclude by saying we need to put the child first, and we need to take in consideration of the negative effects it will have on a child if we hold the parents responsible. Thank you.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industry.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition requests that parents should be held for the children's social media activities, should not be held for the parents for the children's social media activities is a nonsensical proposal. As stated in the Child Proclamation Act of 2012, a child is defined as a person under the age of 18 years. Franklin Roosevelt once said, "We may not be able to prepare the future for our children, but we can prepare our children for the future." According to the Encyclopedia on Early Childhood Development, a child's mind is developed during the first 5 years of birth. During that period, it is the parent's responsibility to instill in the child proper norms and values. Therefore, if parents do not do the necessary training, they should face the consequences. On Monday, 19 July 2010, at a political meeting, former Prime Minister stated that firewalls would be placed on laptops given to every SEA student to prevent them from accessing negative websites. But, Mr. Speaker, today I stand before you saying that was a total failure. Students were smart enough to hack the laptop and disable the firewall. How was this a positive impact? This created more harm to the young generation. This is where the negative effect of technology were easily seen. Online bullying and child pornography came into effect. Mr. Speaker, the opposition is blaming us, but I want them to know that we are cleaning your mess from 2010 to 2015. All these implementation you are giving us today, why didn't you implement this before 2010 when you all gave out laptops? Presently in Trinidad and Tobago, social media continues to be easily accessed due to high rate of electronic device ownership and internet subscription. According to the Index Monday of Trinidad and Tobago Telecommunication Service of 2018 results show that a total of 846,000 persons has internet subscription. And according to CNC3 News, statistics given by the Honorable Prime Minister, a total of over 2.4 million persons in Trinidad has mobile subscription. So my question to the opposition is, since parents are buying these devices and paying the internet bill, why shouldn't they be held accountable? Shouldn't it be their responsibility to teach the children the proper way to use their device? The opposition would then say that they are not educated. So my second question to the opposition is, why buy the device if you yourself don't know how to use it? Mr. Speaker, for us, the government believes that if we hold parents accountable for their children's social media activity, we will see drastic improvement, not only in academic performance, but also in social skills. This government have been working on measures with the Ministry of Education, Social Development, and Family Services to include in the curriculum a mandatory course in social media ethics so children can properly be aware of these online platforms, not only for students, but also for parents. This government is putting in place and will continue to put in place rules and regulations for young individuals and parents to use their devices and do what the opposition couldn't have done in 5 years. Mr. Speaker, grooming them from now is our top priority because they are our future leaders. Thank you.
Member for Naparima.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, somehow this government has convinced themselves that the motion brought forth is forward thinking and all our problems with these unregulated social media platforms will be resolved. There's no widespread empirical examination presented on the effectiveness of this parental responsibility motion. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, imposing fines, damages, or even a jail term may only serve to worsen the problem at the root of these unregulated social media platforms by our youth, and thus cannot be solved by such a simple approach as parental responsibility laws. I argue that the parental responsibility motion is only a band-aid solution for combating youth online offenses. The presumptions by this government of the parental responsibility laws is that the threat of civil damages will better encourage parents to supervise their children, leading to a reduction in juvenile delinquency. Where is the evidence to indicate a correlation between the parent's account and a reduction in juvenile delinquency? Will these laws have a disproportionate effect on minorities and single-parent families, in particular differently able parents and single mothers? Imagine a single mother of 2 children who works 2 jobs and one of her boys commits an online offense. She is now sent to serve a sentence and her other son is left at home by himself. Granny always cannot be found, and now the gangster on the block is marking her son for recruitment, all for his sake. And he is the only person looking out for the child, all for the sake of an online offense the mother did not commit. this motion has failed to bring forth a solution that can help eradicate the problem and accommodate our heterogeneous society. In the US, where 17 states have passed some form of parental liability legislation, opponents have raised important concerns which focus on the broader social implications of the motion. Firstly, parental responsibility laws impose class-based ILDs on families that cannot meet these goals. It also disproportionately affects women. Secondly, the cost of prosecuting parents under the parental responsibility laws could be better spent on supporting parents with programs to enable and empower them. Fourthly, Mr. Speaker, penalties of the parental responsibility laws will only further burden overwhelmed parents with economic disadvantages. The underlying problem, as heavy fines, may increase families' already unstable economic position. Ministers alluded to incarceration or programs that the government would create and instill for parent accountability. An individual is bound to lose their job if they are incarcerated. A growing number of our adults in society will be in our nation's jails, decreasing productivity in our labor force and reducing contribution to our local economy. Our local correction costs will skyrocket. Paying for jails' rising financial burden will inflict a severe punishment against one group in particular, our local taxpayers. To the Minister of Finance, are you going to sit idly by and allow such outcomes? Will the country need to take another loan to sustain our country's infrastructure and running of services? Also, let's not forget our youth. Separation from their parents would also lead to less supervision and control, with some sociologists, for example, Thomas Simi, argue it is at the root of youth delinquency. What does the state have in place to adequately replace the parent as the primary socializing agent? Might it not be more prudent to work along with willing family members, such as willing mothers or willing fathers, to develop the desired patterns of behavior before such stringent use of the state's court system? Appropriate solutions will be those that focus on early intervention and collaboration rather than coercion and conflict. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
The Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I am most grateful for this opportunity to contribute to this debate. Mr. Speaker, parents and guardians must be held unquestionably accountable for their children's social media activities. Social media is internet-based and gives users quick electronic communication of unlimited content. Its misuse can lead to anxiety, addiction, cyberbullying, and exposure to pornography, just to name a few. The activities online today are significantly different from what it would have been in the past. Previously, social media was used as a means of disseminating useful information. Now, it has advanced and has opened doors for the negative aspects to come to light because of the proliferation of unregulated social media platforms. Exposure to violence, pornography, extremist views, and gory images all desensitize children who are exposed to it. Who knows, children with easy access to social media may have been exposed to the gruesome killings of members of the Muslim community in Christchurch, New Zealand this year. This unfortunate incident was streamed live via the Facebook account of the killer, Brenton Tarrant. Mr. Speaker, you will find that in most cases, the parents are the ones giving these children these devices, example phones, and they are to be held responsible. Mr. Speaker, the National Parenting Policy, page 8, published by the Ministry of Social Development, it poses the questions, who is a parent and who simply carries the responsibilities of parenting? Parenting goes beyond the provision of food, clothing, and shelter. it is critical that parents instill good morals and values in their child. The parenting role can be considered as a continuum, as the role now shifts to support the social and developmental needs of the child. Mr. Speaker, the member for Chaguanas East would have raised the question whether parents under the age of 25 are still to be held accountable as their brains can be considered as underdeveloped. Mr. Speaker, the government has implemented measures to ensure that this group of persons are accountable as they can be considered as vulnerable. The government has made note that the vulnerable groups of parents are teenage parents, single parents, and parents with disabilities, just to name a few. I would like the member for Chaguanas East to know that we have implemented training programs, workshops, and educational programs for the aforementioned group of parents in an attempt for them to take full responsibility of their parenting role. Section 2 of the Children Act, Chapter 4601 states, and I quote, "In determining whether a parent, guardian, or person with responsibility for a child has failed to exercise reasonable care of or supervision over a child, the court may consider a number of the following factors: whether the parent, guardian, or person with responsibility for the child has sought to improve his parenting skills by attending parenting courses or in any other manner." So, Mr. Speaker, this law shows that it imposes certain responsibilities on the parent, but it does not deal specifically with the child's online behavior. Once the proposed amendment to the Children Act is adopted, it will put the onus on parents to educate themselves and keep up with the trends of social media. Mr. Speaker, we would like to establish a policy for first-time offenders to have access to educational programs in digital literacy to ensure that they are not only punished but educated as well. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, and I quote, "There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither political nor popular, but he takes this position because his conscience tells him it is right." End quote. And so it is with parental responsibilities. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I submit to this honorable House that in all circumstances, parents are to be held unquestionably accountable for their children's social media activities and ought to implement measures of control which, as previously stated, can take a number of forms. A measure of control in this regard goes a long way in a child's development. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Member for Caroni East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me the opportunity to come into this debate today. I would first like to address something on the opposite side. The Minister of Energy said that the brain fully develops at the age of 5 years, but the member for Laventille West, you said that the brain fully develops at the age of 25 years, didn't you? I am sorry to say, member, but apparently your own bench is coming against you and contradicting your words. But on to my point, Mr. Speaker, I will be talking on proper parenting and tech-savvy ways. Let me start by saying, government, that there are parents who take control of their children's lives and do the best that they can do, but still, sometimes children go astray despite their parents' teachings. I am hearing too often from the members on the government side that parents are to be at fault because they aren't doing their jobs or are not teaching their children right from wrong, as if this is the obvious reason as to why the country is facing growing threats associated with children and their social media usage. And I am sure that the members of the government are going to continue to say that parents need to instill the proper morals and values into their child, and that if they do so, then said child will not commit these crimes. But I'm here to say, Mr. Speaker, that that is false. A parent can't do everything in their power to mold their child and try to make him into the best person they can be. But this does not ensure that said child will be an upstanding member of society, a model citizen. And for the government to even insinuate that is nonsensical, Mr. Speaker. As I recall, in fact, there was a girl in my class. Her parents were at every PTA meeting. They were constantly monitoring her phone, her social media usage,
and were very involved parents. She was my friend, I knew her. And well, one day I went into the office and I saw her sitting there with a boy from another class, and it was only after I found out that they were in there because my friend had sent that boy a nude photograph. As you all may know, that is considered child pornography, a crime punishable by law. All this to say that some parents do the best that they can, but cannot always help what their children do or what their children get exposed to or who they are exposed to. Despite what the government says, proper parenting does not ensure a proper child. And despite all this, ministers, you all are saying that parents do not control their children and need to take responsibility because they are not doing what they are supposed to do. Well, I must commend you all on your bravery because you all have just insulted the parents of Trinidad and Tobago. This leads me to my sub-point. Let's take into consideration the government. No, I'm sorry. Ask me again in 5 minutes. This leads me to my sub-point. Let's take into consideration for a moment the government's perspective, because we are all ultimately here to ensure the safety of the children and the future of our country, right? All right, so you all believe in helicopter parenting, essentially, right? That parents should overlook what their children are doing and get their phone passwords, etc. Well, Mr. Speaker, even if they have these accounts to log into, can they just get it somewhere else? Can they just log in somewhere else, Mr. Speaker? Even if they have the passwords to their phones. We are all young, tech-savvy. Come on, be real. Your parents, as soon as your mother takes your phone, your Wi-Fi all of a sudden is off. So no messages can come through. Your parents can only see what you want them to see. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that children know more and will know more about social media than their parents. So, Mr. Speaker, quoting from a study run by CEO and tech entrepreneur Alan Schwartz, with teens across America, he wrote, and I quote, "The statistics reveal that 71% of teens admit to hiding online activities from their parents." 71%, Mr. Speaker. Should a parent be blamed for something that is out of their control? Despite doing all that the government said they should do, teaching their children and trying their best to lead them down the right path, children still deceive their parents and stray. Should the parent be held accountable for this? To conclude, I say that it is clear that there are issues surrounding children's use of social media, without a doubt. But what if the parent did do all the right things? All the things the government said they should do. They gave rules and regulations for social media and their children, and yet they still committed some of the heinous crimes as mentioned in the motion, such as child pornography and cyberbullying. But the parents did all the right things that you said they should do, so how is it still the outcome? I'm asking, what then? What then? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Trade and Industry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to make my contribution today. Firstly, I would like to address the member for Caroni East. The energy minister said that the brain of the child develops at 5. However, the minister for Laventille West said that it is fully developed by 25, which are two different things. Now, when a crime is committed, we all in this house must believe that justice must be served. And when justice needs to be served, liability must be posed. Now, I would like to ask the opposition, do you really believe that children must be liable, held liable for their online crimes? Parents of today give birth to their children during the Generation Z. That means they are aware of social media. They are aware that social media is rapidly being updated and is rapidly growing. Parents have the duty to stay in touch, to be updated through blogs, through programs which the government provides. Parents have no excuse to put the liability of their children's actions on them, even when the parents are doing their utmost best. the children still cannot be held accountable because that is when the term vicarious liability comes into play. For example, an employee can be held liable for the employer's mistakes throughout the work because let's say an accident took place where the employee got in an accident with the car. The employer is still held accountable. So, Mr. Speaker, you're trying to tell me that an employer could be held accountable, the employer will accept liability for an employee who they are not related to, but a parent cannot accept liability for his or her own children activities. That is ridiculous. Legislation, just as I said, legislation, like parents, needs to be updated, and that is what we, the government, are doing. We are updating legislation because the reality is we are in the 21st century, and the legislation says nothing about the cyberbullying, which is indeed a prominent thing throughout Trinidad and Tobago. Adopting legislation will address the concerns of victims of cyber crimes, such as those who are exploited by child pornography, such as those who are victims of cyberbullying. My friends on the opposite side of the bench would like to see statistics about this and statistics about that, but it is not statistics, it is the children of our country. These children have names and they have gone through the repercussions of all these cyber crimes. They face depression and other mental things. That is why we need to consider adopting legislation so that justice is served. The liability must be placed on the parents because the parents can understand legislation. A child will not completely understand that, oh, I am breaking the law. No, they would just say that this person said something and I'm coming to say something. Or I am sharing a funny video because even though she's showing a little skin, it's a funny video. But a parent, a responsible parent, would work with the child, would develop a friendship with the child and show the child that, no, this is indeed wrong. And if you do this, I in fact, will have to accept liability for you. Mr. Speaker, the government is not responsible for disciplining the children. The government is responsible for implementing legislations. The parents are responsible for disciplining the children. As I conclude, I would like to see the government.
Time has expired. Member for Sawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to participate in this debate. As the motion states, and whereas social media minimum age restrictions do not prevent children from using these online platforms and being exposed to the associated risks, and whereas children may not possess the same level of maturity and discernment expected of older social media users. Earlier on, a colleague on the other side said that a child is considered someone under 18. However, the Children's Authority Act, Chapter 4, Verse 20, Section 2, states that a child means any person who, in the opinion of the court, before whom he appears or is brought, is above 7 and under 14, meaning the age of criminal responsibility begins at age 7. To add, Mr. Speaker, KCM, a cyberbullying advocate, stated that the more that parents try to control what their children are doing online, the more sneaky children get and the less parents know what they are doing online. It is also the opinion of KCM that this in turn creates an adverse effect and contributes to an increase in cyberbullying. So after presenting these 2 points, Mr. Speaker, what position do we really leave these parents? There is no denial that parents are the caretakers of the home. However, how many hours does a child really spend at home? Parents can only control what is in their control, Mr. Speaker.
Platforms such as Instagram encourages other users to report other users, whether they are underage, post abusive content, or even hate accounts. It is also assured by this same company that they are operational 24/7 to investigate these matters and even shut down accounts. So therefore, as I close, Mr. Speaker, it is my rightful opinion of myself and my bench that parents should not be solely responsible for their children's social media activities, but ours as well as the leaders of this nation. Thank you.
Minister of CARICOM and Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government takes our responsibility in protecting the future generation very seriously, and therefore we propose that Trinidad and Tobago adopt legislation that holds parents liable for their children's social media activities. Mr. Speaker, it is indeed my honor and privilege to speak on this motion today. As a member of the United Nations and a leader in education in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago must reinforce its commitment to uphold protocols and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which stands strongly against child pornography, sexual exploitation, and bullying. Mr. Speaker, by adopting legislation, Trinidad and Tobago will become thought leaders for our fellow CARICOM countries and ensure that we maintain formal and cordial relationships with regional and international countries and bodies as we seek to address these issues. Mr. Speaker, our government considers adopting legislation where parents are held liable, where they have failed to exercise due diligence in the supervision of their children and their online presence. Parents need to understand, Mr. Speaker, that the technology they give to their children can be used to inflict harm and break the law. They also need to understand that by allowing their children the privilege of going online comes with responsibility and liability. Mr. Speaker, I would like to talk about a landmark case in Florida where a 12-year-old girl committed suicide because she was relentlessly bullied online by her peers. This is the same story that the opposition member for Lopino alluded to, Mr. Speaker. But what he failed and coincidentally left out was that before pressing charges, the sheriff asked these parents to bring the girls in for questioning, and they refused, Mr. Speaker. They refused. So the question is this: are these parents' ignorance and apathy towards their daughter's cyberbullying criminal? Should this sort of gross negligence and willful blindness be criminal, Mr. Speaker? If a child killed someone while operating a parent's car, the parents can be held responsible. If a child killed someone while operating a parent's gun, the parents can be held responsible. So if a child breaks the law while using a computer or cellular device given to them by their parents, how is that any different? Parents must be held responsible. If parents won't adopt responsibility, it is up to us, the government, to hold their feet to the fire and ensure that they share liability, especially when their children's online actions have life or death consequences. Mr. Speaker, a 2019 United Nations report stated that the online gap between parents and children is underlined by the disparity in the amount of time parents believe their children spend online and the actual time they spend online, Mr. Speaker. A 2009 survey of 9,000 adult and children internet users stated that children spend twice as much time as their parents believe online. This underlines the need for parents to adopt responsibility when it comes to their children's online presence. Mr. Speaker, we propose that parents are mandated to financially compensate the party harmed by his or her child's actions. This will force parents to not only seek the best interest in their children, but also aid in reducing the amount of violence, abuse, and exploitation through social media. Mr. Speaker, member for Barataria said that parents cannot monitor their children 24/7. However, I would like to say to the members that mentioned that it is all about proper upbringing. Each parent is given the equal chance to properly instill morals and values in their children. And once this is done effectively, Mr. Speaker, there is no need for constant supervision. Further, we on this bench believe that our legislation can act as a catalyst for parents to place emphasis on the proper upbringing of their child or children. Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I would like to say to the opposition that our legislation is not about jailing and constantly fining parents. It is about creating morally responsible and accountable parents so that as we propose to educate them in the process by making parents attend seminars and lectures by professionally trained psychologists on these issues so that they can understand the grave consequences of their children's negative use of social media. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for St. Augustine.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to make my contribution towards this motion. We, the opposition, believe that before we attempt to pass a legislation holding parents and guardians accountable for their children's online behavior, we must first put in place measures to educate these parents on social media networking. One must remember that parents and children of today grew up in two completely different worlds. The children to whom the motion directly applies are referred to by psychologist Jean Tweng as Generation Z. Members of Generation Z are true digital natives. From earliest birth, they have been exposed to the internet, to social media networks, and to mobile systems. Mr. Speaker, how then are parents, many of whom were only exposed to the internet in the latter part of their lives, supposed to effectively control their children's online behavior? Mr. Speaker, how are they to be held accountable for their children's online behavior when they do not have the resources to educate themselves on social media networking? How does the government have the audacity to attempt to pass a legislation holding parents and guardians accountable when it is the government who has rendered parents helpless when it comes to effectively monitoring their children's social media behavior? Members of the government have mentioned that the government will be implementing programs on social media ethics for parents. But my question is, when will these programs be implemented? Will they be implemented after a host of parents have already been incarcerated for their children's actions? It seems to me that these are just empty promises being made by the government, and we will not stand for these empty promises. Prevention is better than cure, and for that we say that these programs must be implemented before we try to hold parents accountable for their children's actions. The Minister of Public Administration spoke to the duty of the state being to protect our children. How is adopting legislation holding parents accountable for children's actions going to protect our children? Shouldn't we be implementing legislation that places strict age restrictions on social media sites that could be harmful to our children? In the motion, which is being piloted by the government, it states that, and whereas online bullying and child pornography are among the growing threats posed by unregulated social media platforms. But I have heard no members of the government speak to how we are going to prevent a problem like child pornography from affecting our children. Currently, children and adolescents are accessing pornography online very easily due to the high rate of pop-up ads for adult sites all over the internet, as well as the fact that few of these sites have age restrictions and age checks. In an investigation carried out by the British Chief Censor in September this year, it was found that children as young as 7 years old, Mr. Speaker, are accessing pornography online. Because of this fact, the British Parliament has charged the British Board of Film Classification with applying the world's first ban on children under the age of 18 accessing pornography online, which will be facilitated through statutory age checks. This legislation is the type of legislation that we should be debating today and should be implementing in our country. And before any of the government ministers could raise the question of relevance to Trinidad and Tobago, one must remember that Trinidad was once a British colony. And our parliament system is modeled after the English Westminster system, and our law is based on the common law of England. And for that reason,
it is very applicable and relevant to apply such a legislation to our nation in Trinidad and Tobago. Furthermore, the Minister of Works and Transport spoke to the theory of nature versus nurture. But I think my learned friend forgot that parents are not the only agents of socialization. Although primary socialization does occur at home and is carried out by the family, there are other various agents of socialization, such as your peers, your school, other youth groups that you could be involved in. So how then can you say... Thank you.
Minister of Community Development, Culture and the Arts.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me this opportunity to be able to make my contribution to the motion being discussed today, being, should parents be held accountable for their children's social media activity? I will firstly like to start off by answering Member for St. Augustine's question. The programs suggested by the government will be implemented at a timely manner when seen suited. So I will then like to start off by stating, laws are framed for bringing justice to society, where policy is framed for certain goals, and stemming from this, we cannot, and I repeat for the opposition to hear, we cannot continue to leave our children vulnerable to the pressures and predators associated with social media. The Minister of Public Administration has moved the motion to put into place measures that will allow parents more agency and rights over their child's social media identities at a young age. And to also ensure that children's rights are preserved as they take control of their online identities. Generally speaking, courts have not held parents liable for their children's behavior unless the child committed the wrongdoing with the knowledge, consent, or participation of the parent. In the situation where courts held parents liable was such that circumstances involved the knowledge of the child being a troublemaker and the parent not supervising their actions. Parents will also be held liable when their negligence, and I emphasize on this point, when their negligence, the parent's negligence, leads to or contributes to the child's wrongdoing. Let's take a moment. Imagine that two parents living in a socio-economically depressed area of Trinidad and Tobago leaves a gun unsupervised on a table, and their primary school daughter or son comes into contact with that gun, and it ends up in their presence. Logic will dictate that the liable parties in this unequivocally scenario will be the parent. I say this to say that in the age of social media, things are becoming more and more advanced and complicated. Should we use this as an excuse to not be involved in our children's life? Parents should take this as lead as to why they should become involved in their children's life. They should take the initiative to learn about these social media sites, take advantage of the things being provided to them by the government side. The Offences Against Persons Act, Chapter 11, verse 8, includes in its definition of harassment, and I quote, making contact with a person, whether by gesture, directly, verbally, by telephone, computer, post in any way, posting on social media or sending harassments are involved in this. Even if you post anonymously or create a fake account, if one sufficient evidence is found, you may be prosecuted. As such, the parent will be considered to have engaged in cyberbullying when a minor in their era engages in cyberbullying activity where the child uses the device provided by the parent being under the age of 18 when they are then considered an adult. So as one of my lean opposition members was saying, that parents will be jailed and will be held accountable for their children's social media activities, I do not see children using this as motivation to continue what they are doing. By seeing your parent being held accountable for things being held accountable for something that you did, will this not motivate you to stop what you are doing? Will this not motivate you to change your ways? This should not even be the case. This should not even be the case where children should not be doing these things on social media if their parents instilled in them the morals and values that they were instilled by their parents. Children have to take lead and example from their children, from their parents. In events that something occurs and a child is in trouble, who are the first person to be called by the police or by special services? Is it not the parents? Is it not the parents that are called to the station to deal with the problem because your child is under 18? Is either under 18? So I conclude today by saying, to the opposition members, I hereby stand in approval. Thank you.
Honorable members, it is now 12:27. This House will now suspend for 1 hour for lunch and will resume at 1:27 p.m.